is just getting started. LeBron putting it simply, in all caps, accountability. We'll be back with more First Take after this short break.
I applaud the just verdict, but it's hard for me to celebrate based on where the whole thing started. George Floyd still being dead, people since then being dead, and not having overwhelming confidence that this is going to be a step in the right direction and not an isolated incident.
Good morning and welcome into a special edition of First Take. Today we will discuss the verdict that will echo through time, the verdict where the real work begins. Stephen A. Smith, Max Kellerman, I'm Molly Karen Rose. Let's get right into it, gentlemen. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin found guilty on all charges in the murder of George Floyd. Chauvin was found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter by a jury Tuesday for his role in the murder of Floyd last May. Floyd's death in the video, which showed Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck for about 9 minutes, became a catalyst for the sports world's racial and social justice movement last summer. Chauvin faces a 40-year maximum sentence for the second-degree unintentional murder conviction, a 25-year sentence for the third-degree murder, and a 10-year sentence for second-degree manslaughter. A jury of 6 white, 4 black, 2 multiracial jurors deliberated for 10.5 hours over parts of 2 days before rendering a verdict. Stephen A., your reaction to this historic verdict?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that while I understand why people are in a very celebratory mood, I am not one of those people. George Floyd is not coming back. He's dead. He was killed by this officer. He'll never be around his family or his loved ones again. He's not coming home. And so because of that, for me, while I understand why people would be in the streets in Minneapolis and beyond celebrating, I'm just not of that mindset. I do love the fact that the sentences came down, that he was found guilty on all charges. I did love seeing his family celebrate, because my heart goes out to them and what they've had to endure over the last year and what they'll have to endure forever going on with their lives without George Floyd in it, at least physically. So we all know that. And while I'm glad for them because they seemed incredibly happy with what transpired, we also understand what comes along with it for them. So whatever way they feel, they are entitled to whatever emotions that they have. And all of us, I think, easily supports them in that regard. With that being said, I'm paying attention to the particulars, and what I would implore everybody is not to take their eyes off the ball. It's incredibly important that we understand what transpired yesterday. Derek Chauvin was convicted. Unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, manslaughter charges. It says 40, 25, and 10 years respectively. That adds up to 75 years. From my understanding, the sentencing, his time in jail will be served concurrently, not consecutively. So what people out there may not understand, some people may not understand, and for the purposes of my opening comment, Max and Molly, I think it's important to explain to people that may not understand. When you are sentenced and your sentence is to be exercised consecutively, that means every charge is separate. And you have to serve one charge. And then after that, you have to serve time for the other charge. And then after that, you got to serve time for the other charge. When it's concurrent, it's perceived as being one crime. Essentially, you might have been found guilty for the 3 charges, but because they're served concurrently, you only get one. You're only being penalized for one charge. Now, I've read reports, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I was reading one report from the Associated Press. They said obviously the prosecution is going to go for the stiffest penalty imaginable, and the stiffest charge is obviously the second-degree unintentional murder, which carries a 40-year sentence. Well, in the state of Minnesota, doing my research and looking stuff like that up, lo and behold, you hear stuff along the lines that says, okay, well, that basically means the judge will give him 20. You're also in the state of Minnesota, because it's a federal crime, it's not a state crime. Since it's a state crime, not a federal crime, I'm sorry, Okay, not only do you get to 20, but in all likelihood, you only serve 2/3 of that time. So we're talking about anywhere from 10 to 12 years, conceivably, that Derek Chauvin could end up spending in jail. Because remember, he's left it up to the discretion of the judge. It's at the judge's discretion what amount of time this individual, Derek Chauvin, ends up getting sentenced to. The judge could give him the stiffest penalty imaginable, or he could cut it in half. And ultimately, usually in the state of Minnesota, they say you only serve 2/3 of it. We got dudes that was dealing marijuana that spent more time, more than 10 years in jail. And this dude might end up getting something like that. So it's incredibly important that we understand that everybody's eyes need to be on the ball. Yeah, he was found guilty. And that's step one. Justice appears to have been served. I lean more along the lines of what LeBron James tweeted when he brought up the word accountability. Because you're talking about true accountability and not being able to wiggle your way around it. Even when he goes to jail, everybody says he ain't got nothing to worry about. Ain't nobody going to get at him because they ain't going to put him in general population. I mean, you hear all kinds of stuff. So I'm kind of wondering, okay, what's going to really happen here? My eyes on the judge. Because now that he has been found guilty by the jury, I want to see what the judge is going to do as it pertains to his sentencing. Because if you sentence that man to 10 years, 12 and a half years, 20 years, it's your discretion. In the state of Minnesota, they usually serve about 2/3 of their sentence if they had no previous criminal record, which he did not. And he was a police officer. These are the kind of things we have to pay attention to, because on far too many occasions, particularly as black people, and we have every right to feel this way because we've endured so much throughout our history. Symbolic victories, while significant, which is something that Max has pointed out accurately so in the past, I'm saying it's not enough anymore. Symbolism, symbolic gestures, symbolic victories, it ain't enough. This man has to pay. He should be in jail for the rest of his natural life. Those 3 officers, one that kept the spectators at bay, the other 2 that assisted even though they didn't have their knee on George Floyd's neck, but they was holding on his body. They need to do jail time too. Their trials come up in August. I'm looking at all of that. And I'm looking at the judge who also during the trial, because Representative Maxine Waters showed up this week and flew from the nation's capital to Minneapolis and essentially encouraged people. She didn't say violence or anything like that, but she was encouraging people to make noise and to be confrontational. The judge was on the record and said to the defense, you obviously have grounds for an appeal to completely, for a mistrial, to completely dismiss all of these charges. That's what the judge said. And this is the same judge that has the discretion of deciding whether or not this man serves the maximum amount of time or the minimal amount of time. These are the things that I'm looking at. So again, I'm very happy with the guilty verdict. It was necessary. I'm glad it happened. But that's only part 1. Part 2 is what I'm talking about. And part 3 is people not forgetting that before George Floyd was killed, was murdered, there was a kid, a white kid, that went into a church in South Carolina, shot 9 people, killed them while they were in prayer. The police, after a nationwide manhunt, got him, stopped him at Burger King for some food before bringing him to jail alive and cuffed. George Floyd passes away after. Somebody else shows up in Colorado who wasn't black, kills 10 people. Somehow he was arrested. But Dante Wright is killed after George Floyd. Before George Floyd, after George Floyd. These things still happen. They're still happening. Let us not take our eyes off the ball. Let us address policing and criminal justice reform. Let's make sure we keep our eyes on the judge who has the discretion of making this maximum or minimum. The job is not finished.
Yep.
It's not finished.
Stephen A., I just want to add one thing to the sentiment you just said. If he was to serve just around 12 years, he's 45 years old. So he would be out in his 50s and have his whole life ahead of him. And he's currently in administrative segregation. So he is being protected right now at this point. Max, go ahead.
I want to actually start by directing this towards, I want to talk to white people who may not get it. White people who don't get it right now. This was an open and shut case. It was an open and shut case. There were eyewitnesses and incontrovertible video evidence unequivocally of a murder, open and shut case. And it came back with a just and really the only reasonable conclusion and verdict that could have been arrived at in this case, right? It's the only one. And yet, do you believe that had this not taken place against the backdrop of a global pandemic and then resulted in nationwide protests, that justice would have necessarily been served like that? Because there are countless, and Stephen A. listed some recent ones, examples of police brutality directed toward black people in this country when the police got off. So I would say the reason this time was different, and this is directed to everybody now, the reason this time was different is because people, black people led, but a lot of people of goodwill and socially conscious people followed and supported, insisted on their voices being heard. They insisted in the streets, nationwide protests, and at the ballot box. Now, what's the result been? There's usually a backlash, right? Here we have a proper and just verdict. It was arrived at quickly. It's the only one that could have possibly reasonably been arrived at. And yet it's cause for celebration, as Stephen A. points out, among many, because it's like, oh my God, we got justice? The reaction has been an effort by the forces of injustice to suppress the vote at the ballot box, see Georgia, where, well, no, it expands access. Well, yeah, to people in rural areas, less, but it restricts to people in urban areas is the upshot. So that's at the ballot box. But also even in the streets. Stephen A., as I'm sure you're aware, state legislatures now are introducing all kinds of bills designed to be anti-protest, designed to make it more difficult to protest, in certain respects almost criminalize protest. Not as a reaction to the attempted insurrection at our Capitol by many white supremacists, but as a reaction to largely lawful protests in our streets, which were a reaction to injustice. So I would say that this was a good and just verdict. And there is reason, Stephen A., I think, for people to celebrate today, and there's also reason to be circumspect, as you point out, in the celebration. I just like to add one more thing. I have noticed some people with good intentions tweeting things out that they believe are supporting the cause of justice. And there's been a big backlash. It's tone deaf, it's insensitive, and I would just say that people should, in this moment, determine, is this person at least trying to be an ally, and kind of edit the response to those people,
give some grace
in a way that's instructive and constructive instead of divisive and destructive.
I agree with you there.
Let me just add one thing really quickly here, Stephen A. Give me 1 second. Max, when you mentioned the fact, would this have happened without the backdrop of the pandemic? I just want to add, would there have been justice if Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old, did not film him murdering Floyd? Absolutely not. So that's a key point we need to mention here. We had this on video. Stephen A., go ahead.
Well, I'm glad you
Molly
brought up
and Stephen A., Stephen A., may I really quickly? Because just to add to that point, it'll take 10 seconds. I now have my eye on, guys, state legislatures. I want to see what kind of bill is going to come up that limits or attempts to people recording these kind of interactions, because my antenna are up, and I believe that could be next.
Darnella Frazier, you brought her up. Molly deserves flowers from all of us. If she had not videotaped, stood there at 17 years old, if she had not stood there and videotaped that police officer, Derek Chauvin, doing what he did, he might have gotten off. We might have never known the severity of his actions, how egregious his actions were. And at 17, and a young lady to do that, I just can't say enough about her. That's number one. Number two, Max Kellerman, like I told you, we don't get on networks. We don't do that on this show. I'm very, very big on that. But there's nothing wrong with calling out particular individuals, okay? Even if they are at another network. And I'm about to do that right now for a second to piggyback right off of what you just said in terms of being responsible and being humane in regards to what happened and what you saw happen, okay? I've been on CNN, I've been on MSNBC, I've been on various networks, I've obviously been on Fox News. I know the Mark Levins and the Sean Hannitys of the world and all of that stuff. And I disagree with a lot of things people say about them, and I disagree with some things that they say, but I still communicate with them. Okay? I'm a fan of the show The Five. I'm a fan of Neil Cavuto and others. Tucker Carlson is an entirely different matter altogether. And I'm not going to engage in name calling or anything like that. That would be inappropriate and unnecessary and unfair to him. But what I will say, when you literally intimate that the jury found Derek Chauvin guilty because they were afraid, okay, essentially of riots taking place and things of that nature, you just wonder sometimes if this is the kind of things that leads to the divisiveness that we're talking about. Because the video is there for all of us to see. I mean, you saw folks on both sides of the aisle talking about this police officer and how egregious his actions were. Matter of fact, I think I heard Tucker Carlson saying that one time. This was egregious, etc., etc. Yet last night, he's talking about how there's people on the jury that probably found him guilty because, you know, they were afraid. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but I saw it and I read it to make sure that I saw what I read and I read what I saw. And you just wonder sometimes, these are the kind of things that make people shake and make people shiver because you realize that in the face of such obvious, flagrant evidence, conspicuous evidence, there's still going to be somebody that opens the subject to debate when there are certain things that are simply not debatable. We saw what Derek Chauvin did. Saw it. The world saw it. There were protests all over the world because of what happened to George Floyd. And yet he goes on national television last night. And says that. That's a problem. I'm not going to disrespect him. I'm just saying that's a damn problem.
It's not debatable.
Stephen A.
Go ahead, Max.
I've worked on and for CNN and MSNBC. Got a paycheck from both those places for a matter of years. I've been on Fox News because I worked on Fox Sports, and I know a lot of the people, or some of the people that you mentioned. My professional relationships range that I meet people in the business and we become friendly, from Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, who I know you're having on Stephen A's World, and has appeared on this show many times, to Tucker Carlson, who we used to exchange holiday cards. I cannot defend the coverage that you just mentioned. Whether I know the person or not, it's indefensible.
I'll just leave it by saying this. I think it's irresponsible